welcome everybody. I just saw the recording notice go up, so you're all being recorded now. Welcome to the Care AI seminar series, and we're going to have an official introduction by Stacey Scott, who introduced us to today's speaker in a moment. So we're delighted to have you here. Just looking at the crowd, we've got math and stats, we've got engineering representation, we've got computer science, and I'm probably missing a few others, but this is just turning out to be a forum where many units on campus and people from outside campus come together to hear fascinating talks. So we're delighted to have you. And I'm going to pass it over to Stacey Scott, who's a professor in computer science, and she's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Graham. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Michael Muller, who I've known since I was a PhD student many years ago. I was trying to think what year we met, maybe 1999, 2000, around that time. So yeah, we're dating ourselves. But yeah, it's been just an honor and a pleasure to know Michael all this time. He was extremely supportive throughout my whole career. I know him primarily through the HCI, Human-Computer Interaction, and the CSCW, which is the computer-supported cooperative work or collaborative technology community that we belong to. And over the years, Michael has done many other things. And he happened to give this, a version of this talk earlier this year to a group that I'm involved in Waterloo. And I was so excited to hear it. And I thought it was so relevant to the goals of Care AI, and many of you that I know are working in Care AI. And so I'm really excited about this talk. So now I'll get to the official introduction. So Michael is a research scientist at IBM Research in Cambridge, on the traditional, which resides on the traditional, contemporary, and unceded lands of the, hopefully I will get this right, Wampanoag and Massachusetts. Wampanoag, thank you for the correction.
Occasionally called the Wamps, but not by people. I don't have permission to say that, so
okay.
I don't.
Good to know. And the Massachusetts people, known to colonialists as Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where I met Michael. He conducts critical studies of human work in data science. It is a co-author of the book Human-Centered Data Science, to be published by MIT Press in this coming February. Michael's earlier research included human collaboration and participatory design practices. Michael pursues social justice work through feminist-informed and indigeneity-informed analyses, including Michael's participation in IBM's public website for racial equality in design. ACM recognized Michael as a distinguished scientist, and SIGCHI inducted Michael into the Chi Academy. Both of them are very prestigious honors. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael and pass it over to him for the talk.
And I almost began to speak on mute. I'm only terrified, that's all. Thank you, Stacey, for that lovely introduction and for your friendship over, yes, a while, it's true. I'm more ancient than you, but yes. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And I'm just going to go to the talk. As I said, I'm terrified, so I'll probably make mistakes, so please bear with me. So this, and I need to do things about images, so I'm just going to fumble with Zoom for a minute. And for another minute, apparently. So this is a talk about forgetting and unknowing, where unknowing becomes a very active kind of verb. Joint work with Angelica Strohmeyer, whose contributions are all over these slides, even though for her it's already the weekend in United Kingdom, and so I'm doing this one solo. We begin with a photograph of Mathis's sculpture of Lethe. Lethe is the goddess of forgetting, according to Greek mythology. In China, there is a different goddess whose name is either Ningpo, or occasionally I've seen it as Po Ming. And they both help spirits actually to forget what they know on the way to a new life. So Let's just do one quotation. Around our tent, the old simplicities sigh, sleepily as leave, trying to get in. We'll wake blank-brained as water in the dawn. That was Sylvia Plath a long time ago. How do we become blank-brained? How do we forget? When is that a good thing? When is that a bad thing? And how complicated does that get? So a trigger warning. This is going to be, some of the content in this talk is going to be really hard. I think a lot of you in Canada have actually thought about the wrongs, the harms, the crimes against humanities done in the so-called residential schools. They will be coming up as examples of a certain kind of forgetting that I think is actually relevant to the kind of work that some of us do. So I apologize in advance if this is upsetting or triggering. Stacy already told most of my land acknowledgement, so I'm not going to read all of these words, except to say, as we've been saying down here in the South, land acknowledgements don't really repair historical and contemporary injustices. They make them a little bit visible. Maybe the content of this talk can make a small contribution to making change. So the outline, really simple outline, but the content gets complicated and messy. Forgetting can be considered to be beneficial or harmful. We'll do a little bit of each of those, and then spend most of our time talking about how we forget in the sciences, but I'll be focusing on the data sciences. And there I'll be looking at, and I'm sorry that the words are so similar, at data silences, the many ways that we forget, some of them beneficial, some of them harmful. And I'll do an example, which is clearly labeled as a rant. This talk began as a rant, and then I sort of packed things around it. And the rant is forgetting in machine learning and the ease with which we forget and the risks of that. And then we'll close with the awkward questions. Whose interests are served by forgetting? And in a sort of, well, I won't characterize it, but how do we forget in our own data practices, and how do we feel about that? So forgetting can be a good thing. In Borges' story, Funes the Memorious, Funes sustains a blow to the head, and as a result of that, can remember everything in his life and is paralyzed by that huge pile of remembering. He even thinks about making a catalog in his head, because he remembers everything, of his memories, and realizes he will pass away before he can finish the catalog. And so his life as a thinker comes to an end because he's so overwhelmed by remembering. Sometimes we remember more than we need. And so a bunch of people have talked about forgetting as an aid to remembrance, an aid to the practice of using memory for purposes that are useful to you or to your community. Well, if there's remembrance, there's also forgetfulness, although it's much less studied and much less talked about. And so as people try to be formal about this, they speak of an object of forgetting, which some people call an oubli, acted on by an obliviating force guided by engines of forgetting in a forgetting community. We might want to think a lot about the obliviating word that's going to come back in during the talk. And a number of people have concluded, and rightly so, forgetting is an important part of memory work. We try to remember what matters. We try not to remember the stuff that's just going to get in the way or distract us. But forgetting can also be harmful. Proctor and Schebenger complained over a decade ago, why don't we know what we don't know any longer? And Proctor has really pursued this in very, very interesting ways. Lamers, we cited this a moment ago, speaks of a forgetting community, a community that forgets together, that perhaps comes to agreement about what to forget, or perhaps doesn't. And when we get to the data silences, we'll talk about some differences of opinion in that. I think I won't read all of every slide, but I do want to go down to the phrase damnatio memoriae, which was a Roman practice in which one emperor would try to remove all memory of the preceding emperor, often with ironic results. People would think, oh, well, why is that person being unmemoried? And so they'd actually attract attention to it. And I wanted to close this slide with a reference to a very odd, very interesting translation that Anne Carson did of the work of Sappho. Sappho's work comes down to us in fragments, and with many, many words that are missing. And so when Carson wrote eventually a performance of the work of Sappho, there was a chorus, like a Greek chorus, which stood behind her. And as she read the words, they said click as a chorus. many women together saying click for all of the places where we don't know what Sappho said next. And so here's an example. Click, if not winter, click, no pain, click, click, I bid you sing. And it became, after a while, a performance of silences, of omissions, of gaps. And so I think we should be thinking about where the gaps are and how the gaps fall on us and how we make the gaps. So how do we forget? And here's the beginning of the longest part of this talk, which is about data silences. Onokwa described data silences as the blank spots that exist in spaces that are otherwise data saturated. Spots that we have left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. Why are those spots blank? Other people have said things like listening to what the data does not say is often as important as listening to what it does. There can be various types of silences in data that we must get past to take the right actions. And again, I'm going to try not to read everything, but here's Proctor again, so I will read this one. The focus here is on ignorance or doubt or uncertainty as something that is made, maintained, and manipulated by means of certain arts and sciences. We make these silences, we make these gaps as part of the work that we do. And so over the years, people have made taxonomy of data silences. And Angelica and I pulled this taxonomy together from multiple sources. And I'm not going to talk about all of these. This gives you a sense of, but I will talk about roughly 2/3 of them. So let's begin. Syntactic silences occur when the data that come into a representation, a structured representation like a database, don't fit. We can think of this in the simple sense as a matter of gender and gender identity. If the database only knows male and female, then people who are intersex have no place in the database. Kata Spiel has been fighting this battle in Austria now for a while. A little bit more subtly, if you want to represent kinship relationships among indigenous cultures, all you've got usually in most databases is father, mother, daughter, son, cousin, aunt, uncle, and all the subtleties of kinship relationships, not all of which are mediated by blood, don't fit in the database. And so those relationships go unrecorded. So sometimes we inadvertently, without meaning any harm, construct a set of options that don't include all of us and don't include our best friends and don't include our loved ones. And so that's a thing to think about. Why aren't you going forward slides? Oh, because I'm clicking in the wrong place. That was a little bit further forward than I wanted to go. Substitution occurs, and this happens to us all the time, especially those of us who love data. When we take the best data we can get and treat those data as if they're the thing we're trying to measure. And almost always, it's a trace of the data. So here's a fancy version of that thought from Desserteau. The operation of walking can be traced on city maps. These thick or thin curves only refer like words to the absence of what has been passed by. They allow us to grasp only a relic set in the know-when of a surface of projection. And so if we remember that our data are representations and are therefore substitutions, then we may know what to do about that fact. But often, and I'm describing myself as well as other people, often we don't remember that we're dealing with traces, and we treat the trace as if it were the data. Related to that is this notion of, it's a fancy acronym, but what you see is all there is. All we have is the traces. And so we assume the traces are the data, and we assume the traces are complete as descriptions of the data. And now that I've said that, I hope we're all saying, oh no, I wouldn't do that. But I think most of us do at one time or another. Annulment is also interesting. Annulment happens when we're trying to focus only on a certain part of the data, and so we try to get rid of the other parts. And in a really interesting series of studies, people have done a kind of annulment in software engineering. In fact, it's kind of a principle, the notion of separation of concerns or encapsulation. Clayton D'Souza and colleagues did a lovely series of studies about how people use APIs in order to focus on what they need to focus on now and hide the messy details that they don't need to think about. APIs, they said, served as communication, contract, and boundary between areas of interest and concerns. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this theme later, APIs are a reversible kind of encapsulation. I can press the details down below an API, but if I need to find them, all I have to do is open that routine and then the details are still there. I'm going to claim that a lot of the things that we do to our data turn out to be non-reversible, and therefore APIs are an interesting analogy, but not quite what we need, because APIs are a form of temporary forgetting, and I'm going to claim that some of what we do to our data is much too permanent. Here's a different way, though, of looking at data silences: structural amnesia, controlling how we will be seen and remembered, and redacted data, removing data sometimes in order to protect people who are so vulnerable that they really shouldn't be visible to authorities. And here are some examples. Angelica's work is here in her thesis about sex workers, who of course need to communicate with each other, but also not to be noticed by certain people. Rosie Bellini did similar kinds of work with survivors of domestic abuse. And as I already made reference, trans people often have to fight against their dead names. They're stuck in bibliographies with their pre-transition name, and they need to redact that and turn that into their current name. So sometimes we need to suppress data about people who need to be protected or who wish to protect themselves. Sometimes we need to suppress aspects of data in order to highlight not the past, but the current condition identity of a person. And so strategized forgetting can sometimes be quite beneficial. This is one which it's another version of a silence, and I hope you'll bear with me. In the United States, this one is really close to our hearts. So here's the song. And some of you may have heard this if you followed US culture. It's called the Drinking Gourd Song, and it's about people going to freedom. And it's a really interesting song because it's a map. As multiple people have said, it describes how to get out of the south of the United States during slavery and make your way north and cross the Ohio River to a free state. Sorry. And it's very instructive. The dead trees will show you the way, because a dead tree has lichen growing on it, but only on the north side. So if you can't find the river, you find the dead tree, you find the lichen, and you go in that direction. Martin Luther King described this song and others as a set of codes. The drinking gourd is the Big Dipper, is the way north. Canada is heaven. I hope you all appreciate that. And Moses, who appears in many of the songs, is Harriet Tubman, or the other heroes who helped enslave people to get to freedom. So what's interesting about, oh, I'm sorry, switched too soon. What's interesting about that is it's a coded song. People who were enslaved knew the code, could decode it, could use it to achieve freedom, and the slavers had no idea. And so people could sing this song and teach this song in front of the slavers and then run. And it was therefore silent to the slavers and extremely clear, extremely audible, extremely legible to the people who needed to know. Now we get to the ugly part. A set of silences which are often done to people or done to knowledge in ways that are harmful. And I'm going to focus, there's a bunch of stuff about those, but I'm going to focus on colonial unknowing, hence the title of this talk, How to Unknow. You know this better than we in the South do. The stolen generation of indigenous children were legally kidnapped, abused, sometimes killed in the residential schools. I didn't update this slide. It's now over 7,000 graves. Horrible things were done. And yet there's a notion that a lot of us aren't supposed to know this. So if these crimes are unknown, then the question becomes, who performs this unknowing? The perpetrators know what they did. They've been trying to remove the grave markers. They've been arranging to have graveyards paved over with parking lots. So they're covering it up. They know what they did. The native nations and their allies know what the perpetrators did. The children didn't come home, or they came home broken. But the rest of us are not supposed to know. And Alamentiak wrote, during the hearing, the government requested an order sealing evidence given in court. which would have prevented the public from accessing it. That was I think in Ottawa. So this is an interesting kind of silence. It's a silence that is done to data, and it's done to the people who aren't supposed to know about it. And as Sabati has said, this kind of silence has implications for our own practices in the data sciences. And I'll get there in just a moment. I want to set up, though, the notion of a grand narrative of data science, because that turns out to be a kind of envelope in which things happen. So you've all probably read that data is the new oil of the digital economy. I didn't put down the date, but data is like crude oil, came out just a few days ago on Medium. So we have this notion of data as being a really great thing. And the grand narratives of data science position data as objective and inevitable, and you ought to believe it and you ought to trust it because it's data and what could be better. And so there is this claim that happens that there might be biased data, which would cause our innocent software to produce biased outcomes. All we have to do is improve the data and then everything will be fine. But what if our software is not so innocent? Bowker wrote, raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. And Gittleman used that as the title of her collection of her anthology of papers about data science. And so if raw data is an oxymoron, if raw data doesn't exist, then the question is, how do we cook our data? Because that's what we do. We have recipes. We go, as Tom Erickson and I wrote, into the data kitchen and we cook our data. And so let's look at how our data get cooked. And this is the rant. Based on a bunch of papers, and I'm not going to cite them as I go through this, but there's a basis for this, is the point of this long, long list of references. So let's build what I call a forgettance stack in machine learning. As Pine and LeBarn have told us in particular, that we make a measurement plan. There's a politics about that. The measurement plan tells us what the data are and what we're going to do with them. The measurement plan is thus a speech act that turns things into data. We don't know their data until the measurement plan tells us they are data. This is far from objective. And Ellen Billis has told us that we can think of data as being discovered or captured. Capturing data sounds like the kind of thing that a human being would do, that would involve human judgment and discernment. But discovering data requires a human to decide to do the discovery, to decide that it's data and it's worth discovering. So again, people are doing things in their data. We clean the data, which is to say we change the data to make the data fit for purpose. Human beings do that. They do that to the best of their ability. They do that with good intention, and they make decisions all the way along. What's an outlier? What are the limits? Oh, is this distribution better than that distribution? We curate the data. We get rid of outliers. Well, depending upon how we define an outlier, we may get rid of entire classes of people. For example, people who don't own their own homes. That would be a simple version of curating data, removing lower income people. Then we engineer features, which is to say we make nonlinear combinations of the data from the previous steps. And here I will tell a very quick story. A colleague, a lovely man, was trying to do a measure of how much of your life have you been working. This was when all of IBM was fascinated with bank loans and the approval of bank loans. And so he did a very simple thing. He said, I will use the number of weeks that you have worked, and I will divide it by the number of weeks that you've been alive. That's my percent worked measure. See, that's really straightforward. And of course, I had to tell him that I was older than him and that his measure actually discriminated against him because both of us had lost a certain proportion of our work time by going to school and, well, by being children. And his proportion of that was larger than mine, so I would have a greater percent work. Then we discussed gender. And as many of you have read, Jess Calarco has said, in most countries, there's a social safety net. In the United States, there's women. And so we know that women are often taken out of the workforce for carrying responsibilities that men typically don't take. And so this also was a gender biased measure. And my colleague had no idea. And he set to work to change it, of course. And I could go on with the complications, but you get the idea. We engineer the features. We apply usually a very naive kind of social theory in order to do that, or a naive kind of data theory to do that. And we put our prejudices into the data without even realizing it, as my dear colleague with best of intentions did. Then if we're doing often if we're doing a kind of classification work with machine learning, we invent data. We make a new column in our data table and we label it with outcomes. Outcomes are real important. And the outcomes aren't in the data. So we had to impose those outcomes onto the data through the wisdom of crowdsourcing the data, or through the wisdom of experts or our own best guesses. And people of goodwill try to do this the best they can. And we're still inventing an entire variable of data. Then we train a model. And by the time we're training the model, we begin to forget all of these human decisions that happened below the level of training the model. Then we evaluate the model. And if we're IBM, we actually do bias testing on the model as well. We create the pipeline. We wrap all of those steps inside of a pipeline, which makes them harder to find. And then we deploy the pipeline. And by the time we deploy the pipeline, in fact, certain information can be sealed up so thoroughly that nobody can see it. This is true especially of some of the social impact, and I say that in a sort of negative way, pipelines that are out there, like for bank loans, like for calculating bail, like for calculating sentences. So we forget that there are all these people involved. And by the time this thing gets deployed, there's kind of a sound like raising the blinds in a window, a clap, 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 clap. And suddenly all that stack, all the lower steps in the stack vanish. And we briefly remember that people did those things, but then we don't remember that people did those things. All we've got is the pipeline and the person who's selling it. And ultimately we just have the bright, shiny object of the pipeline, thus obscuring all of the human decisions that went into that. And none of those decisions is systematically recorded. And that's where I'm worried. We have systematically forgotten all of the information that could bring doubt on our pipeline and on its outcomes. But a little while ago, I was talking about colonial unknowing. And is this really as serious as colonial unknowing? And I'm going to try to claim that the answer sometimes is yes. Redlining was a practice. I don't know if it happened in Canada. I rather suspect it did. But in the United States, certainly, redlining was the practice of drawing a red line around the place where poor people live, thus indicating that no loans would be granted to those people, and probably there would be a lot of over-policing inside of the red line, hence redlining. Child Protective Services to this day applies European-based notions of what a healthy family is, what a family should look like, what relations should be like in a family, and legally kidnaps children away from their parents, away from their families, and sends them to foster homes or to be adopted by other families. It's still happening. In carceral systems, there's just a series of things which take people away from their families for decades, that destroy family structures. And in medical decision-making, we do this weird thing of saying, well, we know how much you've previously spent on medical stuff, so now we can use that to predict the seriousness of your current illness or injury, and we can use that to predict how much medical care you ought to receive. And the notion that poor people might have carefully tried to avoid medical services because they couldn't pay for them just doesn't enter into that. So these are really troubling kinds of decisions that we are making using these systems that are full of human judgments. And I want to say then, in summary, we keep the poor people poor. We still steal children from their families. We destroy families. We take away a breadwinner, both breadwinners, for periods of decades or more, and we kill people. So yes, data unknowing is another form of colonial unknowing, and we do it, and I wish we didn't, and I wish I didn't, and here we are deep in this system, and we are part of it. And so by unknowing the uncertainties in our data, by forgetting all of those human decisions and all of those human changes that we made in our data, changes that we typically don't record, unlike in the API example where it's reversible, we perform a kind of God trick. We legitimize the data methods as scientific, objective, inevitable. We keep the data, but we discard most of or all of the human traces in the data. And then the data looks so nice, and the model looks so nice, and the deployed system looks so nice, and it does these highlighted things which hurt people. So I'm almost at the end of the talk. There are two ways of getting to the end of the talk, and here's sort of the happy pathway, the innocent version of approaching a conclusion. Starting with Evelyn Waugh in Brideshead Revisited. It's a sad story about a person who loses a lot, and so he re-encounters a place from his past, and he says, "My theme is memory, that winged host, for we possess nothing certainly except the past." He's lost everything by that time in his emotional life. And so we can think of this in the data sciences as a kind of memory as a social practice that links people and things through time in the process of shaping history. We have dispositional practices that help us to select those memories that we want to select for preservation. We forget as an aid to memory for what matters. However, in the data sciences, unlike in the Waugh quote, we don't even possess our own past because we don't record it as we change it. We systematically arrange to unknow the past of our own data. Which takes us to the less happy version of this, motivated forgetting. And so back to Proctor, who studied various forms of forgetting for several decades. The focus here is on ignorance as something that is made, maintained, and manipulated by means of certain arts and the important word sciences. The gaps in the data that we make in the course of doing our day-to-day work with data. I want to look back briefly at discourses of legitimation. To the extent that we can create ignorance about the weak parts of our story, well then the grand narratives, the meta-narratives look really good. Those gaps, those silences, those constructed ignorances strengthen the argument for objectivity, inevitability, the God trick of saying the system did it, there was no human involved. We're sorry you didn't get the job. We're sorry you didn't get the loan. We're sorry we took away your children. We're sorry we put you in prison. We're sorry that we didn't give you the medical care you needed. All of that, suddenly there's no we in those sentences because the system made all of those decisions. And so we do selective forgetting through data silences, as I've tried to indicate. Some of them are positive. Some of them are deeply, deeply disturbing. We keep the data and a little bit of impersonal metadata. We discard non-conformant small data in the service of big data. We discard almost anything that looks human that might reveal the human fallibility in data science. And we do this not because we're bad people, but because that's the way it's done. And so these strategies of forgetting become strategies of legitimation in a kind of colonialism that we practice when we do data science. And so here's kind of the unhappy conclusion. These unknowing practices work, as I just said, as discourses of legitimation. They make data science look really good, really objective. If we could make our forgetting practices recoverable or reversible, we could begin to reform them. And I think there's small pieces of work toward that, but I hope there's going to be more of it. We could eventually make them more ethical. I'm not saying they are disethical or unethical, but there are ethical problems. And I'm describing my work, and I think I'm describing some of your work too. Well, we're sort of looking at a set of infrastructural practices and technologies. And so if we think about the forgetting as an infrastructural practice, then we can say, who needs to forget? Who needs to remember? When do we transition from people who need to forget, i.e. to focus on what we need to do, into people who need to remember? And if there is such a thing as forgettance, then which involves the unknowing of our own weaknesses, our own data weaknesses, then how do we change forgettance from what it is now, which is kind of a projection of power, into something that's much more positive? If we think of this from the technology side, how can we create much better records of how we change the data? And can we make those records in such a way that we can reverse the changes and reconsider whom we omitted or what kind of data we decided not to record about someone? And can we signpost the rememberable information for other people who may need it more than we do? Ultimately, the question is, how can we calibrate our forgetting and remembering so that they do what we want them to do instead of, I would claim, what they're doing now? And finally, if we are able to do that, then here we are. We've been to school, we speak in polysyllabic sentences. How do we make these questions legible for the people, communities, and nations who may be harmed, who are being harmed daily by our forgetting practices? Well, we forget a lot of things. Here's Leave again. And I want to leave you with 3 questions which have to do with forgetting. And here they are. What data do you systematically forget in your data practices, data science or other data practices? Who wants you to forget, and whose interests are served by your forgetting? I myself do not have good answers to these questions. Thank you. I'll leave those questions on the screen.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
That was as good as the first time I heard it. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you.
It's there's so much information in there. It's overwhelming, but still very, very interesting and really makes you think. And I hope that it's made this community think and maybe realize why I invited you here in the first place, because I thought that there was a lot of really good information there for us to all think about. If there's any questions, you could either unmute yourself and ask or put something in the chat. I'm happy to
Great.
open it up.
Questions or denunciations if you disagree. Denunciations are useful too.
Yeah, this is conversation.
Yes, please. Oh, you can't have nothing to say.
Well, maybe I'll start with a question and give people some time to just digest that, because it's a lot of things to think about. There's been a lot of discussion within the Care AI community and in the broader AI community about explainable AI. Do you think that explainable AI has a place for addressing some of these forgetting concerns?
Yes, no, kind of, which isn't a very good answer. I am thinking, I guess there's time for this silly story. When I was in graduate school, which you can see was a very long time ago, my advisor needed to do something particularly fancy with the Unix operating system. And so he found Fred, the psychotic computer consultant, to modify the Unix operating system until it allowed him to generate very, very precise auditory stimuli. And while Fred was doing this, he decided that the Unix operating system was pretty good, but it needed to be changed a little bit because he was very interested in the human mind, and he wanted the Unix operating system to perform more like the human mind. Only the trouble was the only human mind he had available to study was his own, and he was psychotic. And there were things that Unix operating system couldn't do. Characteristically of Fred, you could no longer kill processes. They ran on forever. And so I'm thinking, when we do explainable AI, whom are we writing for? We often are writing for people like us. Upal Ehsan and Samir Passi have begun to do experiments of presenting exactly the same explanations. It's a robot talking to itself while it does tasks. So there's actually nothing that the user can do, or the subject in the experiment can do, to change the robot's behavior. So it plays out the same set of explanatory statements. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. For computer science students is one population, and explicitly people who didn't know computer science as the other population. So you know what I'm going to say next. Yeah, it turned out really differently, and in interesting ways differently. In one version of it, there were 3 different streams of explanations they used. In one version, the robot just reported numbers, and certain groups found those numbers to be of high authority, even though they didn't know what the numbers meant. And so this kind of an odd belief in the significance of numeracy, even if we don't possess the numeracy. So I think, yes, we need to be doing much more with explainable AI, and we need to know who our audience is. And I would like us to think of an explanation as a communication act between 2 human beings with some technology in the way. And the person at the other end of that explanation is probably not us.
Yeah,
that still doesn't really
sense.
tell people, well, why didn't I get the loan? Or why did you take my children? What can I do to get my children back? And the explainable AI is not going to give a good answer to that question. And I wish we need to have better answers to those questions too.
Yeah, those are really tough societal issues to be dealing with. And sometimes maybe computer scientists are not always the ones that are motivated to work on those.
Yeah. Well, and in some ways, we have bosses too, or we have the boss may be SSRN, or it may be CERN, or it may be the National Science Foundation in the United States. They tell us what to do, and so our hands are somewhat tied. And so how much resistance can each one of us do to some of those unthought through social agendas?
Yeah. So I know Graham has a lot to say, but Deb Stacey's asked a specific question, so we'll get that first, and then Graham will hand it over to you for your mind whirl of thinking. So Deb Stacey, she's a colleague of mine in computer science. She asks, since models often use data that demonstrate many aspects of what you are talking about, how would you suggest that modelers make visible the issues with the data that they have used?
Good question. Lots of piece part answers and no satisfactory answer. So I'll start with the piece part. If we make a data frame, I think about pandas as an example in Python, but there are lots of other data frame representations. Those are typically two-dimensional things. In pandas, typically, and I know there are exceptions to all of this, the individual records are the rows, the columns are the variables. We add columns sort of at the end of the list as we do feature engineering, as we add ground truth. And those data frames have no memory other than their current state. So simple, stupid first idea, what if we kept versions of those? What if the data frame itself kept versions of its prior states? But that's not enough, because we also need to know often who did it. Who thought this was an outlier and why? They might be right. On the other hand, if it's a borderline outlier case, then we might want to talk about that. And like my friend who came up with the multiply discriminatory version of percent of life worked, we may want to have a conversation and maybe change it, but we won't know what the theory there. My friend had a theory about what it meant to have done a certain amount of work in your life, or to have spent a certain amount of your time in your life working. Turned out his theory was pretty naive. And so it would be good then to find out whose theory it was and go back and do some revision on that. And then I begin to wave my arms in the air because I don't know how to fork a data frame in any way that makes any sense. And fork isn't even the right word. Some of you actually do computer science for a living, so you can see I'm out of my depth. But some way of doing our own version of counterfactuals. Well, what if we made the model like this? Well, what if we made the data like this? Well, what if we recoded our sense of curation of outliers? What if we included back in that class, that entire class of people that we inadvertently, without intending to do it, excluded from the analysis? How then would jail sentencing change? And I'm using those dramatic examples. There's lots of good things that we do with data science too that don't involve those social theories. I don't mean to be saying data science bad, but data science complicated, I think I want to say, and data science ethically complicated, I also want to say, even though, I do it badly because I don't have any training in computer science. Some of you do it very well. I hope we'll all do it more thoughtfully.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for this talk. It's been very interesting for some of the work that I'm doing, and with one of the other people that's on here, Cassie Raymond, who is a PhD student in computer science, doing a computational science PhD. We're working with a lot of international data on animal populations, disease, agriculture, and there's huge issues about how that data is captured and how it's, who owns the version of it that's put out for public consumption, and sort of the attitudes of modelers who just want the numbers. Yes. We've had them say, like when we bring up all the problems with the numbers about, well, a bad number is better than no number, and it's like, it's hard to fight that kind of attitude, particularly when there's a task to be done and there's deadlines and there's people pushing that. But at the end of the day, a lot of those models are going to be used by people who are going to make decisions.
Yes.
And that'll affect people. And so if you start out with bad data, it's hard to see how you're going to recover through that. But I like the idea. I know I see Graham has put about the idea of having like versions, but it's even beyond versioning, because it's like, why is it like that? Who wants it like that? And which data that you're going to use. So this was very helpful for our, because we've been going over and over this, but how do you do it? And, you know, like, how do you demonstrate to people that this is a big problem? So thank you very much for this.
Oh, thank you. And I guess I want to lean heavily into the notion that it's not just the data that we put, I think you've already said this, but it's not just the data that we put into the model, it's how we change those data in the course of making them fit for analysis, fit for purpose, which everybody has to do with all of their data. I do it with interview data. I do it, you know, grounded theory is in many ways a way of making a set of abstracted concepts from the data fit to purpose. So I am not innocent in this in any way. I like the fact that grounded theory makes its constructivist nature, according to Kathy Sharma's, much more explicit. But it's all constructivist. It's just that numbers look like they haven't been constructed. I'm saying the same thing for the fourth time, so I'm going to stop.
Yeah. Can I just add one quick thing on there? And it's about the temporal aspect of data, because one of the things that when you're trying to do longitudinal studies is that things in the past could be very, you know, very different. And, you know, there is this the problem that a lot of things are forgotten, even in international systems like ISO standards, like even trying to figure out what is a country. That changes over time, and ISO actually reuses coding after 5 years. And so, you know, like things that you're getting from 10, 20, 30 years ago actually could have a code that was valid then that now means something else now. And so a lot of that hasn't been taken into account in international standards about this, is if we don't do longitudinal studies. So,
thank you for saying that. That was such a good example. I think in your country and in my country, what is a nation? What is a tribe? What is a band? Who is recognized in those ways? We don't do as much with formal treaties as an organizing concept as you do, but all of those questions come to the fore as soon as we begin to know indigenous people to work with, or spend time with in our case. My spouse works in the arts, and there's a lot of arts funding for indigenous artists. And so, yeah, those definitions shift, even though the nations themselves have been here since time immemorial and do not change, only in the way that human civilizations always change. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm preaching, I'm stopping.
No, thank you. Thank you for the talk, though. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Graham, I think maybe have time to formulate some.
Oh, yeah, I'll ask a question. I know I don't want to take it over, but it's such an amazing talk. So many different ways of making us think. And you know, when Stacey suggested you and the topic, was really excited and just completely delivered on all the expectations and over delivered. So thank you so much. So I think maybe I'll be a bit selfish and ask a question that has to do with something I'm dealing with right now, and which is delivering a course outline for an undergraduate machine learning course. And I think about your Venetian blinds, right? And all these levels and the people involved. And I think the way you describe it to us assumes that we know what each of those steps mean. Like, at least we understand them at some level of detail, and we can, you know, it makes sense to us because we already know what, you know, data collection is, or data cleaning is, or training the model, or deploying the model. But I want to ask you about thinking for people who are encountering machine learning pipelines for the first time. And if you were to go about designing a machine learning course that was aware of the issues that you bring up, would you basically design the course to explain the whole stack and then discuss, you know, what you were discussing now? Or do you think there's a way, or maybe you've already done it, of teaching the machine learning pipeline in a more embedded way that uncovers these issues as we learn about each of those stacks in the Venetian blind?
Wow. I work in industry. I don't construct syllabi, so I'm the wrong person to ask, but that of course won't stop me from answering because I talk. But I'm not going to give you a very satisfactory answer, which I think is the theme of my answers so far. One way might be to say, I'm going to tell you the way that people think you're going to think about this, and then I'm going to knock it down, which is rhetorically for me often an interesting way to go as I write papers. See, we thought it was simple. Oh my. Back when I wore glasses, at some point in that, I would take my glasses off to look earnest, and say, but then we have to think. But I could also, depending upon, I guess, what we think people are going to do with the syllabus, with the material they're learning. Thinking if it's people who are going to do this kind of work, well, then I'd probably want to go at it step by step. How did you know those were data? What were the alternative data? Who performed the speech act that said, I see data? All right, now we've done that. Now, how do we clean the data and what are our choices? For a practitioner, I think step by step could be very valuable, although somewhat harrowing. If it's people who are, one of the things that I used to do is sort of teach people either how to do human factors usability stuff or how to manage human factors usability stuff. So the managers, they very definitely had an outsider view, and I'm thinking a policymaker possibly is not going to do data science, but they're going to need to understand. So I might set it up and knock it down for the policymaker and try to maybe knock it down several different ways and help them to understand that it's not one thing, it's a bunch of things. And there's the option for them to exercise some care and judgment, and I hope they will. For the practitioners, as I said, I think I would be much more fine-grained. See, I said both things at the same time. That wasn't very good.
Thank you. But I mean, I'd love to ask more. Let's see what other questions are out there first.
So I know Gus had some thoughts that he wanted to ask about.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Michael. It was really great. So I'm a philosophy professor, and we brought in some philosophers for the speaker series, and actually thought your talk was in many ways more philosophical than some of the philosophers we brought in. So I for one, really appreciated it. So yeah, I guess the question I wanted to ask was sort of about the title and the way that you use this phrase like unknowing quite a lot as one of the projects, one of unknowing. And it strikes me that philosophers for at least 2,000 years have been at pains to try to distinguish between a belief and knowledge, right? So what is it about knowledge that makes it not a mere belief? And then I also thought this Venetian blind metaphor was really lovely, and so I guess it seems to me like if that's on the right track, and there's all these assumptions that are baked into the pipeline in a way that's sealed off, it seems like it's really not so much unknowing as unbelieving. Right. So if our knowledge practices are sort of reliant upon these assumptions that get collapsed and collapsed, it's like we didn't have knowledge in the first place. We never did. It was always belief. And in many ways, we're not justified in holding those beliefs in the way that we think we might be justified. So it's not really, like unknowing is almost like giving too much credit. Right. And maybe like unbelieving, maybe is better.
It's a good thought. And I'm not sure I make the distinction at this point. And why am I saying that? I am, as I make reference to my age, I'm gray. I'm over 70. I forget things. I forget things I've done. A long time ago, David Millen asked, well, can I collaborate with myself in a meeting of Irene Greif's group? Irene Greif in North America is the founder of computer supported cooperative work. In Denmark, it's Kjeld Schmidt. That's a different conversation. And so David wanted to get us to think, and he said, can I collaborate with myself? And we all went, oh, David, he's a deep thinker. But it occurred to me later that I often need to collaborate with my future self because I'm going to forget. Now, once I've forgotten, is that knowledge? Is that belief? I'm not so sure. There's this notion in some of the social sciences of social proof. If enough other people think it's true, then I should think it's true too, because after all, how could all those people be wrong? This unfortunately is the basis of bystander effect, where somebody's in trouble and no one helps because the social truth is no one is helping, so I shouldn't help either. It's a terrible thing. So I don't, some other people have said, yes, you're talking about epistemology, and I'm not sure. I'm talking about practices at the moment. And I guess I want to say in my series of unsatisfactory answers, I think practices have ontological and epistemological aspects. And a little bit, I'm not going far enough inside of people's heads to know how that works out for Stacy, for me, for you, for Graham, for Deb. I think each of us probably draws some of those lines in different places, which from a philosophical point of view is a terrible thing to have said. So I'm sorry.
No, I mean, it's okay. And I guess, like to the extent it was a criticism, it's just saying like, by the arguments you've laid out, you might be giving too much credit to the idea of like unknowing, right? And that if we sort of like push your argument all the way to its logical conclusion, we never had this knowledge from data in the first place. It was always just belief. And maybe, it wasn't a justified belief in the way that we tend to think of knowledge as a justified belief. Yeah,
I'm hearing you. And at the same time, I'm thinking of knowing as a very constructive act. And I'm about to be over my head because I have not studied philosophy. So I construct my knowledge based on, well, yeah, some data, and yeah, based on the people I talk with. If I didn't know Angelica Strohmeyer, this would have been a different talk. We constructed it together. We constructed what I just told you from my own head together. So where's the knowledge and belief boundary there? Some things I believe because Angelica says them, and Angelica is amazingly smart, and some things I hope she says because I said them to her. And so is that social proof? Is that hearsay? Is that but sometimes Angelica will say something to me and I will it'll make me think, and then I'll construct some new knowledge. And I would claim that in the sociology / ethnography / social sciences / qualitative analysis practices of grounded theory, not grounded truth. The naming is unfortunate. In grounded theory, it's very much about constructing abstract categories up from the data. And so the data are there. They might be objective, they might not, depending upon your position on, on a bunch of things that you could talk about much better than I could. Once we call them data, however they got to be data, well then we often do things with them in order to make them fit for purpose, I said before, but also into the things that we want to know, which is in part making them fit for purpose, but also in part controlling what it is that we're going to know about. Someplace in there, I use beliefs in order to control my construction, even though my construction was based on what might be knowing. But I made what I knew. So I'm really not giving you a good answer because I think I'm in a different part of, if I understand philosophy at all, I'm in a different part of philosophy from where you're talking from.
Yeah, no, it's no problem at all. And I don't need to like drag us all down the epistemology rabbit hole here, but yeah, it was really stimulating. So thanks again for your
talk.
Thank
you. Well, your question was great. It tells me what I don't know. So now I have to go and figure it out. So thank you.
Thanks, Gus. David, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just sitting here trying to formulate it. The first thought, no, lots of thoughts. So I'm not a data scientist, but I deal with data. I would like a quantitative HCI person is how I describe myself. And I'm thinking about, so we just got a Chi paper accepted, which is rare given the acceptance rate, which is good. And I'm thinking about a few things. I'm thinking about what did I teach my student through that process. And one of the things, so what Graham was talking about a little about building a syllabus, I'm thinking about training my grad students. And there are those times when they ask a question and I say something like, because that's how it's done in Chi, and I can't give you a better answer than that because the community has defined it as this.
Yes.
And then I think about, so I don't know, the paper Andy Coburn published, Hark No More, about pre-registration of Chi experiments. And it gets me thinking about this data pipeline that you're talking about of how robust would it be if you had to get somebody else to build your data pipeline for you? Like each of these pieces was not contracted out, but made transparent and public, which might improve it, but also just expands that society or that community that's agreeing on what is truth. And so it might not fix it unless it's the whole everybody who's ever lived. And so it just got me thinking about my own practices with the data that I collect, and questions like, is an outlier anything besides inconvenient? Is our view of what an outlier is like 3 standard deviations? Done. I've done papers with lots of data where we did everybody outside of 1 standard deviation, cut them off. We have like 30,000 data points. That's easy. God, we still got lots. Easy. It's like, we just said all of you don't count.
That's exactly what you said. That's exactly what I have said too. So I'm not pointing my finger at you. Or it's like in the 12-step programs where there's 1 finger pointing at you and 3 fingers pointing back at me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's just, but right, I still have to, like you said, I still have to publish papers. I still have to finish and train grad students, and I can't leave them in this epistemological puddle of like, I don't know. I'm a quantitative guy. I like data. I believe in Plato. I think there's an objective truth that we're discovering. This is tricky. So there's lots, but I don't know. So I don't have a question. I just have, there's a ramble.
Yes.
And
it's a good provocative ramble. I think Jeffrey Bardsell would claim that Chi papers are a form of argumentation. In fact, I think I've read that from him someplace. And so what do we do when we are engaging in argumentation? Oh, so many people on this call could say this so much better than I could, but we try, argumentation is a form of persuasion, or as B.J. Fogg used to say, captology. Now I used a lot of syllables in a word that I can't define. So we have to speak the language of the community in which we're trying to make our point. When I've never done a TED Talk, I'm not likely to do a TED Talk, but when people more famous than me in my field do TED Talks, I believe they use a different form of argumentation from the form that they use in a conference paper. And indeed, if I were rewriting a paper, a rejected Chi paper, and I have a lot of those, if I were rewriting that for, say, group, or for designing interactive systems, or especially for European computer-supported cooperative work, I might, so the data might survive, but most of the argumentation would have to change, especially for ECSCW, the European form of computer-supported cooperative work. It's a very different way of thinking about things. So numbers are really, really good on the American side. Work practices are really good on the European side. So, and articulation theory would be a good thing to talk about. And I believe in all of that. And so where am I going with this? It's not argumentation always has, well, it's like an explanation, isn't it? I seem to be saying the same thing, but not realizing it until the last minute. An explanation is a communication from one person to another person with some kind of technology in the way. Conference paper submission, the conference paper published is a communication from one person to another person with a different kind of technology in the way. Some of it printed page if we go back far enough. And I think I just said the same thing over and over and over again. So of course, the truth, even the data are going to change depending upon who I am and who you are and how I want to communicate with you. And when you give them back to me, you'll change them again. And all of that is probably a good thing, but it would make the people who believe in objectivity, I hope, shift a little bit uncomfortably in their seats.
Thanks.
Including my former self, with whom I occasionally collaborate also. And back when I believed in objectivity of data, it makes that former version of Michael shift uncomfortably in his former seat too.
Which is one of your collaborators. And I totally believe in collaborating with my past self and my future self. I write notes to myself because I forget everything. Or the more disturbing one is I unremember and re-remember papers that I've read so that they are more convenient according to the narrative that I'm trying to say now. That's the most, like, one of the most disturbing things. It's like, that's a fact in my brain. It's like, and then I go look at the paper, it's like, it's not there.
Yeah, I've had that experience too.
It was far more convenient before I went and checked. And then so the paper that we just got accepted was an expansion of a paper that I got accepted in 2015. And in that paper, we had a clear winner. And when we thought about it long enough, the clear winner was not a clear winner anymore. So this paper is undoing the win of that one. I don't want to redact that paper. I'd like this is still good and it's setting a pathway, but it's how do you communicate this? It's like we were wrong, or we thought too simply about what we were doing. And so now we're more complicated, and that old winner's a loser now. And so, yeah, it's, I'll stop talking. Lots of other people have lots of other stuff to say. But thanks, Michael. Very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I know there's a lot of PhD students and other students on this call. Please hope you feel comfortable. Michael's a very nice person, as you're finding out. If you'd like to speak up and ask a question, please feel free to do that. You can think about it. I'm going to ask another question. So, Michael, I thought it was very interesting in your the analogy you made to software engineering and all the forgetting that we do in software engineering, which I teach software engineering as part of the courses I teach, and we talk a lot about compartmentalization and encapsulation. So you're exactly right. There's a lot of very systematic, intentional forgetting or hiding of certain things, but there's also a realization in the software engineering community that could be a bad thing, and forgetting around decision making is a very bad thing. So there's a whole area within software engineering, I might get it wrong, but I seem to recall it's called Rationale Tracing. So being able to trace decisions that were made in software so that when someone comes to a piece of code and they want to change it, that there's somewhere to look to say why it was like that in the first place. And so it makes me the notion of tracing decision making, in my mind, I see the Venetian blinds and I see, lines through it, and being able to go back and say, okay, what data was thrown out. And then in my mind, that's a great thing. You can trace everything. But then I think about what I've learned over the last year or two about, using CNNs or these new machine learning and deep learning methodologies where you haven't even made the model. You're using a model someone else made. And so all these pre-made, pre-trained, so it's using data that you may or may not even know about. So I think it's a really interesting, it's a huge problem to be able to think about that traceability. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on ways that we could do that, more open sourceness of these types of things.
Only failure stories, unfortunately. None of, well, one of which I was close to. I was a user. But I'm thinking there have been a series of models, by which I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? Not actionable, I'm sorry, I can't find the word at the moment. Operationalized models of decision processes. What was it? IBIS, issue-based information systems in the 1980s, which eventually then had a user interface that made it graphical, so that became GIBIS, pronounced gibbous, which it wasn't, but, and there were 5 kinds of knowledge and only certain kinds of linkages between knowledge, or arguments, actually not knowledge, were permitted. And then when that reached human-computer interaction, it became, I think, a 3 rather than 5 kinds of argumentation, 3 kinds of argumentation. Again, a set of moves you could make or couldn't make between those. And they were about recording decisions. I think in HCI, it was called design space analysis. And it looked really promising, and people made it, and they set it available for people to use it, and nobody used it because it took too much effort. And within IBM, there was a somewhat ahistorical effort to do the same thing. I forgot, ours had discussion in its title, but it was really design space analysis with slightly different versions of restrictions and linkages between things. And I guess what troubles me is we're all in a very, very big hurry to finish the project or to get the Chi paper submitted, he says, thinking about his own revise and resubmit email that came just this morning. in which people said, well, you know, the discussion seemed kind of rushed and also the abstract. So, okay. So how do we make it incredibly easy to record that history? And I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. At one point, we played with a version of a Jupyter notebook. By played with, I mean, I made pictures and people wrote on the pictures on a poster and told me why I was wrong. This is not technology design. This is ink. Of a Jupyter notebook in which the things you did to the data would be recorded, and at one point or another, you could press down on the speech button and tell it what you'd done and why. And I thought maybe that would be lightweight enough so that people would be willing to. We never built it. So I think possibly it was a bad idea, just maybe. But I don't know what the good idea is to preserve that. And I'm trying to think, are there other fields in which that kind of preservation is done better? And I'm not sure. Which makes me feel, now I'm shifting in my seat. The present tense Michael is shifting in his seat, because I can't think of an analogy of an analogous set of operations in a different field in which that actually works.
Can I jump in? I really
Please.
have an idea that I'm excited about, because Stacey has this cool idea of like sort of rationale tracing. And I think the way to do this is hook it into practices that developers or machine learning practitioners are already using. People use Git, right? Like as they're developing their pipelines, people are making commits. I also pointed out data version control, which is similar, right? Like you have like a commit history. And to make something like this very lightweight, we have natural language processor, we have ways of extracting information from commit logs. So to make it lightweight, you kind of hook into existing practices, and maybe there's a syntax or even a natural language people can express these decisions that doesn't require them to use another tool or change their workflow in any way. I think that's the only way it's going to work, because I totally get what you're saying. It's like the too much effort it's just too large a problem, right?
Yeah, the excursion to an external system, I think, is one of the things that's made this so hard. And so if it could be built into, as you just said, I'm really repeating your point, thought for thought, but in different language. If we can build it into people's work practices so it's already there, then maybe. I don't know. We're discovering in IBM, I can't do a whole lot of details on this, but that there are 4 systems that people use to do arguably a single piece of work in their job. And so the effort is now, well, why don't we put a front end on those 4 systems so that people can access them in one place? We've done this about every 10 years, you know, and the trouble is it doesn't work every 10 years. So I'm hoping this one will, but there's something about tools unification that's really hard. And I don't know what it is, but I keep on seeing it happening with really, I'm going to go back to Michael rhetoric, you know, people of good intent, really smart people with good intent, trying really hard and it flops. Which is a completely useless answer to what you said, Stacey. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's good to just have a discussion around these issues, because we're not going to solve it today. As you mentioned about the workshops, people try to solve it. But I think this is the kind of reflection that people in this community need. And I think, Graham, like, I love to hear you thinking about how do you incorporate this into your grad course or an undergrad course. I don't know which it's grad or undergrad, but because if the people who are making these systems don't think about these things, who's going to think about them? I mean, they really need to be thinking about the decisions that they're making. And that's absolutely first step. I did want to point out that Cassie Raymond, who said she unfortunately is in the quiet section of the library right now, so she can't unmute herself and ask a question. So she added some thoughts in the chat. And one of the things I wanted to point out was she was talking about she mentions the idea of provenance and thinking about the provenance of data and trying to make that transparent. And so, Michael, I was wondering whether you knew of any efforts in that respect.
Yes, I do. And one of them is under review, so I can't talk about it. I mean, I was the reviewer in this case. So to start with the stuff I can talk about, if we think about people who are curators of data sets, not of data records, there are various commercial companies that will do this. You know, oh, you need address data? We got address data. Just pay us and we'll give you the API to the address data, and then you'll have addresses for everybody. But also much more complex things. You know, we have a good solid database of the fauna of this particular region. They know the provenance of their data quite well. It's part of how they make them scientifically useful. There's a sense in which you can have sort of good quality provenance or bad quality provenance, or provenance that's good for this purpose. You can fill in that whole sentence, paragraph better than I can. So that happens, and that happens a lot. And if they are commercial entities, well, then they'd really better know their provenance. And so there's motivation for getting it right. In addition to the scientific motivation, there's also the commercial motivation. But that's data set by data set by data set. Data record by data record by data record, I have seen much less. Again, there's something under review, which might be moving in that direction. In a way, this is sort of the data frame that remembers what it did, what you did to it before, or that remembers its prior state. And when I first thought about that, I just thought, oh, well, if it's a two-dimensional data frame, I'll make it a cube, or I'll make it a three-dimensional projection. That's easy, problem solved. And you all know that didn't work. That didn't work at all. So it's a hard problem. And part of what we need to represent in some cases is, well, what was the discussion among three people about this particular record or this field in this record? If we think about how ground truth labels get applied, sometimes we say, well, we've asked 3 physicians and 2 physicians said this, but the other physician said, no, it's not a symptom, it's a side effect. So now we need to figure out why that is. And possibly then we need to reconvene those physicians. Oh, but they've all gone back to their practices. So how are, we have data like those in IBM. And where at least it's paired physicians. And then if the pair doesn't agree, well, then you flag it, and you flag it during the same session and get it resolved. But we can't always do that. And we can't always do that if it's crowdsourced, blah, 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 blah. So I'm back to saying we need a memory and we don't know how to represent it, and we don't know how to obtain it or acquire it, I guess would be a very data sciencey way to think about it. We don't know how to talk people into doing it, is the other way to say it. And
yeah, it's definitely very time and energy and cost intensive to get data, certain kind of data, especially like, for instance, the kind of data you're talking about with experts, but even just if it's rare data, you know, how do you deal with that? But I think that it's encouraging to hear people even working on the problem. So you're talking about these different, you know, up and coming papers. People are understanding it's a problem. And I think that's the first step in all of this, is like problematizing it. We don't do enough of that in our field, is saying this is a problem. Now, you know, smart people will go and think on how to solve it. Or iteratively think about it.
I think that's part of what we're trying to do in the subpart of the CHI conference called Critical and Sustainable Computing. The point there is to take the critical look and say, not necessarily this doesn't work, but we know less than we think, or we could think differently, or look, this can be construed not one way, but 5 ways.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's a question from, hopefully I will get this name right, Uwern, and he's asking, or she's asking, I'm not sure. Do you think going back to K nearest neighbors classifier, which has a slow inference time, gives us some way to remedy the possible problem of model forgetting? So really, like, it's choosing.
Yeah.
The bigger question is, does it matter which model you're choosing?
It's been well over 10 years since I touched k-means as a clustering tool. At the time that I did it, but no, I did say 10 years, so it's probably better now. I couldn't tell which solution I wanted. You know, you have to say, well, I think there's 3 things there. Okay, now make it into 3 things. Oh, but maybe there's 4 things. Oh, well, and then since I grew up sort of in ordinary least squares, I wanted to see the error term. I wanted to know how much variance was accounted for and how much wasn't. Not that that's only advisory for making a decision. In my life, I've done more principal components analysis than k-means analysis, but it comes out into the same sort of problem eventually. How many factors do you think are there? And so how much of the variance do you think you ought to be able to account for? It is 60% okay? Great, let's use the 3 factors. Oh no, I need 80. Well, then I better use the 5 factor. Oh, but I don't know what that 5th factor is at all. It's only got 1 variable that loads on. That's not a factor. Blah, 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 blah.
And then does that come back to the outliers discussion?
Yeah,
If you're throwing out the tail, is that, are those important things to be keeping in?
Well, or even if we think the problem's in the data, then we can say, well, we didn't sample right and we need to get more people or more instances from this part of the world, this kind of culture, this race, and this gender identity. One of the truisms that people say these days is trans women of culture seldom get bank loans because, well, we've never given them bank loans. And so we don't know if they repay bank loans. That's not going to get fixed if we continue to use those data. But there's also the question about what's a good solution. And now we're back to argumentation. For certain kinds of data and for certain audiences, explaining 40% of the variance is a really, really good day. And then other audiences, other settings, if you're below 80% of the variance, well then, so sorry. Why don't you go back and do this right? And I think my experience of k-means was that I didn't even know how to say that. So I think k-means is certainly one thing that we use in order to construct our knowledge. But there's other clustering methods that we could use to construct our knowledge differently. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm just saying the same thing over and over and over again. We construct what we know. Nothing is going to give it to us. Life is hard. We have to live with it.
But I do think it's worth talking about, even the same thing in different contexts. Like, let's talk about it related to this particular model, which a lot of people on this call might know about.
Yep.
And think about that. Like, you've thought about these concepts for a long time. We haven't. So repetition is good.
But you have in your own domains, or else you wouldn't be publishing if you hadn't thought about it. It's sort of a question about what lens we look at it through, but we all have to figure out how to make our arguments. And we all have to figure out what it is that we want to know and how we're going to be satisfied that we know it. Yeah. When I go from, say, working with people in fempower.tech, where most people are doing qualitative research, back into IBM, where it's very positivist, I have, as it were, epistemic whiplash. From Zoom call to WebEx call and back again, and I have to do both kinds of work, and so and that's not unique to me. People are nodding. I'm seeing you nod. You have had the same experience. Mm-hmm. But so, almost, what do we need to know? In some broad sense, how do we need to have known it?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. The term bad data has come up several times in the talk. And when I think about that term in the context of what you have talked about today, I really think about a lot about my training as a qualitative researcher and the very open discussion around the fact that you put your lens on whatever data you collect. And, so you have your bias, like you admit you have a bias and this is what you're looking for. This is your lens. And I think a lot of times when we talk about bad data, it's really just that data was collected with a different lens than the people who need it now or want to use it now.
Yes, I think so. And so it became bad when it was used in this analysis, but it was actually good when it was used in the other analysis. Christiana Floyd said something similar to this must have been in the first Aarhus conference, which eventually became the book Computers and Democracy, a Scandinavian Challenge. She said, well, we have methods and we have code that we can prove is correct today. and tomorrow it's no longer going to be provably correct. It's in fact going to be incorrect tomorrow. And that's what it's like when you think about the work that we do as a process instead of as an object or a product, was what she said. And so, yeah, I think yesterday's good data can become today's bad data, but sometimes it's the flip, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's true too. There's a question from Louisa Anthony. She's another colleague of mine from computer science. She's asking about what your opinion is in data sheets for data sets proposed by Gebru et al. Lisa, are you able to unmute yourself? I'm not sure if you're in a position to ask that question.
Sure. Thank you for a very interesting talk, and definitely thought-provoking. And I'm very passionate in thinking about the data that I work with and how we can mitigate some of the issues that you're talking about. So more recently, and actually I co-teach one of our courses on AI and society. And I was thinking about, how I can incorporate some of this data discussion with natural language processing and how, the data is affecting I'm actually starting teaching these modules next week. So I've been thinking a lot about, data and, there is some discussion in the machine learning community, and one of the proposed solutions is to come up with these data sheets for data sets, which I think is more common maybe in industry, and I think it can mitigate some of the issues that you're talking about. But especially, I'm thinking it would be useful to starting doing these data sheets for data sets, so that people, when some of us in computer science, we take some data, and sometimes even if we want to do maybe the right thing or think more about the data, we don't really understand the cultural context, how it was collected, and I think it would be useful, at least for people that are interested in this, to see this description of the data, how it was collected, what was the context, what changes were made to the data from the raw data, all these versions that we're talking about. So I was just curious, what's your opinion on that?
Utmost respect for Gebru, first of all. I have not read the paper, so let's start with ignorance. We in IBM, this was not my project, so again, my experiences as a user and as an annoying voice in group meetings. We had I think a similar notion. We called them fact sheets, although they were for models, not for data sets. And so it's not quite the same thing. And what we discovered with the fact sheets was, so the notion of a fact sheet, I'm sorry, for people who haven't been deep in this conversation as you have been, we thought of fact sheets as being like the nutrition label on a can of soup. How much calcium does it have? Is there any potassium in there? How many grams of protein? Okay. So people tried to do that with models, and you've seen cans of soup. You know how big those labels are. Our fact sheets were at least 20 pages long, and in part because they were written for so many different audiences that so section headings mattered a lot, because people needed to skip around in them, and reading one was exhausting. That was I was a user in the experiment, and I thought, oh, I can't do this. So where am I going with this? What do we need to put in the fact sheet, and how do we make that in the data sheet, and how do we make that navigable by the people who need to know the information? I think that's a solvable problem, but I don't think it's easy. A little bit, I would claim that the vendors of data sets, or the curators of data sets, the services I was talking about before, the ones who could give you a really nice catalog of the fauna in Nova Scotia, they're doing something like that. They are also capturing, some of them are capturing a great deal of provenance, but to borrow from, no, I can't say that yet because the paper is still under review. I've not used those services. I've not gotten one of those data sets and then tried to figure out what's in it, what's not in it, and whether I believe it. And who am I to believe somebody else's data anyway? So I like the idea. I'd need to read the paper and learn a whole lot more. And I'm guessing that we're going to need to work on that concept before it solves the problems that I talked about.
Yeah, I think it's at least to me, it sounds like there is a good direction to go in, but I think your point of some of these data sheets, fact sheets, they end up being very, very long, and then you really have to have the researchers being willing to dive into that and that be part of researching the problem. You're also researching the data and where it's coming from and what's the context. What they recommend in the paper, they have some types of questions that you should put in your data sheet about the provenance, and they're talking about the genealogy of the data, about the use cases, and all different questions. But I don't think it's limited to that. I think it's more for people that are creating data to be able to describe in such a way that other people that are taking your data so that they know where it's coming from. And that's something that, in my research, so I actually do work on record linkage and data integration. And one problem that I face and I would like to work more on is that we generate this longitudinal data through the record linkage process. But really, from the computer science point of view, there are some interesting methods and algorithms that we use there to improve this process. But however, once we generate this longitudinal data, there are going to be other people in social sciences, economists, historians, because I work with historical data, that are going to take the longitudinal data and do this subsequent analysis. But those subsequent analyses, they're going to be very, very dependent on the data that my group produces, and how we can actually document that and make sure that whatever we're generating is going to be a good start for subsequent analysis. So that's why I'm thinking about all these issues.
No, I agree with you. And I think, I guess I want to say, I think we are insufficiently meticulous in recording what we do to data. I don't want to say that data are these passive victims of human activity. But we change the data. We should. That's part of making sense. That's part of making the data fit to purpose. I think the short version of my talk is we don't record how we change the data. Sometimes we don't even know why we changed the data in the way that we did it. Oh, it seemed like a good idea. It was lunchtime, so I just, I had to do something. I imputed the mean. Okay. And I come back from lunch. What record did I impute? Oh, never mind, because there are another 20 records that need something done to them because they have missing data too. We do that all the time because our technology doesn't help us to record or recall what we did. And so it's very, very fine-grained provenance that I'm worried about. At the same time that I have huge respect for the more macro level provenance of where did the data come from. Almost one version of provenance is chain of ownership. So who had the data first, who had the data second, what did they do with it, or with the data. Yeah, we need that too, very much so. I think we're talking about a sort of micro versus macro kinds of problems, and the trouble with the micro problems is they build up and then they have macro impact. So I think you and I are talking about slightly different problem domains in which many of the words that we use to describe it are the same words, but I think they have slightly different meanings in those different contexts, which other people were saying earlier about other kinds of issues in the same domain. So I'm not saying that's a brilliant insight on my part. I'm really just repeating what somebody else said about 20 minutes ago.
No, thank you. This was very, very interesting. So I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. It's another good one that makes me think, oh, I don't know about the answer to that. So those are good questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. We're past time and lots of people are leaving for various reasons, commitments at 1 o'clock.
Sure.
But there's been lots of, Michael, I don't know if you've seen the chat, but there's been lots of thank yous and really appreciative of the insight that you brought here, which I knew you would. So I'm super excited that people were able to hear your insights too. So thank you very much and lots of clapping.
Oh,
the
thank
background
you.
for
Well,
for
and
Michael.
brilliant questions. Really, questions that were hard for me to answer. So those are the best kinds. So thanks to everybody, and thank you, Stacy, for inviting me, for your friendship, for everything.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was great to see you again.
You too.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
you too. Bye.
Thank you, Stacy and Michael. Thank you very much.
Thanks.